we're basically a steering committee that has been working through the Grand Victoria Foundation to build a more robust, connected, and I guess resilient network of conservationists in Illinois for the purpose of increasing the preservation and management of our natural areas in the state. And one of the tools that we've been using and that we're trying to use more are these webinars that we call vital sessions, where we invite professionals from throughout the state who are working in different aspects of conservation to share their information and connect with more of their peers around the state. So we're very pleased today to welcome Katherine Moore and Mario Longoni. I hope I said that right. Katherine Powell, sorry. Moore Powell, okay. Who are both from the Keller Science Center at the Field Museum. Katherine is an eco-hydrologist, and so she studies how water moves through ecosystems. She's also the climate change ecologist at the Kellogg Science Action Center at the Field Museum. And Mario is an urban anthropology manager at the Action Center, and he's works from a perspective of anthropology that communities possess the knowledge and capacity that they need to address most challenges. And so they're going to be giving us a presentation today about a project that the field's working on in collaboration with local and regional partners to develop a climate change adaptation, or to conduct a climate change adaptation planning process for prairie grassland habitats throughout the Chicago wilderness region. The goal of the project is to engage communities, land managers, researchers, conservation organizations, and experts to build on existing climate change vulnerability assessments and outline strategies for climate resiliency and adaptation. And clearly there's a lot of interest in this. So I would like to thank Katherine and Mario for joining us today and turn the program over to them. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And go ahead and get started. We're going to be both speaking, but I'll take this first segment. And I just wanted to let people know the way we have this structured is we will break this into about 4 segments where we will present some information, and then we will have some questions, and we'll pause at that point and actually have some interaction, take questions, so that you don't have to wait to the end. So these are roughly the 4 segments we're going to be broken into. And I'm going to do the climate impacts, and then Mario and I both will talk about how the Prairie Climate Adaptation Project is structured. We'll go through some examples in another segment, and then we'll wrap it up and talk about some of the next steps. So let me start by simply mentioning something I'm sure all the callers are aware of, which is prairies were once a vast and extensive type of habitat throughout the Midwest, though with agricultural conversions and land use change, they have diminished greatly to a fraction of their former selves. And now we have additional threats coming from climate change. For our project, we are focusing on the prairies that you would see throughout the Chicago wilderness region. And that can be things like the Medawan tallgrass prairie, a very large, extensive restoration of, or remedy ones that haven't changed since those early days. You can only find those usually in things like cemetery prairies. We're also including green spaces you'd find in urban systems, such as Burnham Wildlife Corridor, which has a great deal of native plantings based on prairies. or even down to the small colonies strewn throughout the city. What you'll see with these urban pieces is that they share a lot of structural components and plant compositions with those rural and larger counterparts, but they're all under threat from climate change. And so the aim of this project was to take a look at what's out there. First of all, there's a great deal of good information about climate vulnerabilities and impacts, but we wanted to take that information and apply it to the unique set of factors that influence this specific gradient of suburban to urban prairie habitats in this region. We also are assessing the social perspectives, and that's where I'll pass it off to Mario to talk a bit about, as well as these ecological considerations, and ultimately outline very specific strategies that can help build more climate resiliency into these habitats. So we will start by talking about some of the impacts that you'll see, or some of the climate stressors. I referenced the fourth National Climate Assessment, which was just released at the end of last year, and it's really beautifully structured, and there's a great online tool, so I encourage you to check that out. But briefly, some highlights are, obviously we're seeing a trend of higher temperatures, and these two graphs are based on mid-century, so roughly 30 years from now. Good conservative estimates are that obviously we'll continue to warm by several degrees, but we are also looking at extreme temperatures, a lot of variability around that trend, and along with that are a significant number of extreme hot days, that is any day above 95 degrees. This is not a projection. These are observations from the 20-year period of the 80s and 90s, the 90s and 2000, 30-year period, 80s, 90s, and 2000. And what you're seeing with those bright red and orange colors are the ways that we're already seeing spring stepping back by as much as 5 days earlier from just that period of time. But we're also expecting, and we're already seeing, an expansion of the entire growing season. So when winter begins to onset. And then with these changes in seasons, the expansion and the shifting, you're seeing more life cycle or phenological mismatch between plants and organisms. Now, when it comes to rain, I love this graph. It's when it rains, it pours, and we are being hit on three fronts here. Seasonally, we're seeing a shift to spring and winter. When it comes to the amount, we're looking at an increase in the frequency and the intensity of the type of precipitation, and the type, even in winter, as we begin to get more precipitation, we're looking at getting both heavier snowfall and winter rainfall. And I can't get over how perfect this, this particular weather we're having is for making this point. And then finally, what sort of region will this be? We are expected to continue to get that great deal of variability, and that means going from flooding to drought and maybe back again with increased frequency. But over the very long period of time, we are expected by the end of the century to get slightly drier, and that we are expecting longer periods of dry between those flooding and rain events. And so that is the end of the first segment. And so having just outlined all that information, the first question that I would love to hear from our audience is, what concerns you most about climate change? And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can.
Yeah, and if you've got something to add, just unmute yourself and jump in. And also, you'll notice in the chat the questions there, and go ahead and type a response and send it to everyone. But don't be shy. Unmute yourself and just, what concerns you most?
So, Katherine, so everyone, this is Marjorie Brooks, and I'm also one of the VLI architects. This is my first Bible session, and so I am still learning and enjoying myself. Katherine, I have a question for you and Mario. How close are we to some important tipping points that look as if they might be profoundly slow to reverse, possibly irreversible?
Well, there is still an awful lot of new research coming out about this. I'm sure everybody's probably heard by now, who knows, I run in different circles, but there has been a lot of talk recently when it comes to doing action on climate change in general, that a group of what they consider to be some pretty irreversible tipping points seems to be looming on a decade to like a 10 to 15 year horizon. Now that's a global one. So when it comes to region specific tipping points, those can be a little harder to tease apart. While we have some pretty good information with these global models, and they're really good, when we go to downscale them, it can get a little more difficult when you're looking at things like tipping points, because we sort of play around with those uncertainties when it comes to those projections. Having said that, I can give some opinion on this, on my sense on some of these things, which is we have probably multiple tipping points here and there. And there's a lot of interaction between these different tipping points. And so if we just break them down into anything to do with water, any sort of, rain events or any sort of precipitation, those tipping points have probably gotten closer. We're starting to see a lot more of what scientists had warned about happening sooner than they thought they would. So that one's a little scary to me, that we are starting to see this. And then when it comes to those extreme temperatures, we're also seeing that those are coming a bit sooner than scientists had predicted. But there is a great deal of uncertainty. And now when you talk about what kind of thing that tipping point brings, we're already seeing a loss of species. We're already, many scientists agree, we're already in our 6th mass extinction. And even though it's outside the region, there's a very troubling report about a significant loss of insects. And I will talk a little more about insects, but I think insects are an area where we have not made enough observations. And it's a little scary when you begin to realize how strongly many ecosystems depend on those invertebrates and their insect populations. And we don't know enough about what could happen if we begin to lose large numbers of those. So I'm sorry it was a bit hand wavy, but that's how tipping points are. If anybody has any additional information, I'm more than happy to factor that into this discussion.
Katherine, there are a couple of comments in the chat. So Brandon Hayes' comment was that there's too slow a response on nearly every level. And Brandon, I assume that's a reference to political whatever. And then Angelo Caparella, his note is extent to which the stressors on human systems will undercut conservation. For example, push to dam undammed rivers due to drought times, which in our area, he's in central Illinois, would drown many of our nature preserves. Yeah. So, and then Robin Flackney, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, that there may be too much reliance on technical fixes that could be expensive and could exacerbate rather than solve problems. For example, irrigation that depletes groundwater.
These are excellent comments. I would add on the technical side, it's not that they aren't helpful and we are going to have, we're past a point where we can't use technical solutions. We're going to have to rely on them to some extent. I think the mistake is in thinking that we can always fix things with technical solutions. And even though it's not as prevalent around here, to give people sort of a sense of what we mean by a tipping point or a point of no return, if you can think about groundwater or any access to water being in by salinity or some other contaminants, that's a really, really long-term reversal in order to clean up all that water. And it's extremely difficult. We can't endlessly clean the vast amounts of water that we need. And so if you just think about water alone as once you contaminate it, returning it to a cleaner condition is so much harder. Then you can start to get a sense of what we mean by tipping point.
So there's a great comment here from Carter O'Brien talking specific to Chicago. He says, even the deep tunnel isn't likely to completely relieve basement flooding due to these stormwater events. Basement flooding tends to impact poorer homeowners, older housing, disproportionately as those homes weren't built with drain tiles and sump pumps. This leads to mold, tear downs, which in turn fuels gentrification, displacement. We're not doing enough to install green infrastructure in the city. So.
It's interesting because for this audience, for me to see so much interest in the political and social sphere, that's where the challenges are coming from. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go forward now about some of those ways of dealing with some of those things.
Yeah.
Should we check the next, look at the next question here?
Yeah. I was going to say, we'll spend all our time on that question, which could take us a while. Oh, unfortunately. Oh, there we go. It did start. Whoops. Oh, and I would say we'll try and, this was very broad, this question, and we can move right on into the next segment and sort of get back to this question, because we will, which is, what do you most need help with to achieve your management goals? This question was very much directed at anybody doing natural resource planning and management. We can, for a moment, see if anybody has anything to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, do we want to hold that question and have you move forward, just for the sake of time?
Sure.
We can revisit this question, and you can put responses in the chat as we go along. But let's, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, if folks just want to put things in the chat about what they're looking for, that would be great.
At this time, yeah.
All right. So this is just a more recent project timeline to give you a sense of where we are. Is this ignoring a lot of last year, the first part, but just to give you a sense, we conducted 3 workshops at the end of last year, at the end of 2018, from September to December. And through those, we stepped through this process of, similar to what I just did, and you'll see more. And we are currently drafting all of the feedback and what we think this resource should look like, and getting a first phase finalized and available to begin to pilot and to begin to use in June. Our hope is that we will have more phases to this and it will keep going. But to give you an idea, there's an awful lot of great information and good organizations that have very locally focused, Great Lakes focused climate data. And so we are doing a good review of that information, in addition to more climate data through larger organizations that work in this area, other partners, and assessments and conservation plans, because in a sense, we want to make sure that we have taken into account all of the good work that's already been done, moving us forward. And the idea is to create an adaptation resource, a document for sure, that has the summary of all this information as it applies to the habitats that we've described here, not just the regular prairies, but those green infrastructure and the urban spaces. And we want to make sure that that resource is applicable. So during the workshops that we held, we stepped through the same information. We talked about the different climate impacts. We talked about the different types of prairies and different habitats that existed. And we talked an awful lot about social considerations, whether that's community engagement or engaging broader political, regional partners. And so we came up with a couple of frameworks to work within. Now, for the ecological side, the framework is borrowed from and changed and basically leveraged from the U.S. Forest Service, which is one of the federal agencies leading the way in adapting specifically certain types of habitats. Briefly, that's a adaptive management approach where you define your management goals, you assess any stressors, you evaluate those impacts from the stressors, then you identify the options which reduce the impacts, and you figure out some way to monitor your progress so that you are, once again, meeting those goals so that you can complete that loop and perhaps adjust your goals. And so that's your ecological framework. And Mario will discuss the social.
Yeah, and so, there's, as we just learned from the brief conversation, there's a need to have a way of thinking about social considerations, a framework for land managers to be able to do that moving forward. So we're trying to address that as a parallel piece here. We've done previous work in the center where we've done a lot, where we've learned about the perspectives of the public on nature near their homes, near their businesses and their communities. And we've learned quite a bit too from land managers about their perceptions of the interaction of themselves and their preserves with the public. And in those contexts, even things like the Chicago Community Climate Action Toolkit, we started to offer recommendations and approaches for how to deal with social aspects. But part of this project is realizing we need to do something more extensive and systematic in terms of helping people have strategies for dealing with social components. So where we started for this process in terms of our method was we did a rapid scan of the social science literature to find out what people's perceptions were. We held focus groups with social scientists so that who have done work in this area, so that they could really help us confirm the scope and the priorities we were coming up with. And then we came up with these 7 considerations that land managers can think about as they're thinking of how do I engage the public, or how do I deal with the public considerations that come up when I'm making changes to my management scheme, or even in terms of wanting to expand and be more active in management. And the last part of our process has been to share this back at various times with the land manager community. A couple of comments on these 7 considerations is you can look at them 2 ways. You can see the highlighted words there, and some of them that jump out are things like perceptions, aesthetic preferences, and conformity. So as considerations, in some sense, they're the things we have to pay attention to from the public. How do they perceive a preserve? Do they have aesthetic preferences on what they want to see next to their house? How much is conformity important to them in their own landscaping? But at the same time, these are considerations in the real sense of each of these is a strategy for working with the public. So, if we take a look at even the 6th one there, consider community science as an avenue for meeting community stakeholder goals. So these are 7 different really strategies for engaging the public that came out of the work that we did. Just to look quickly at a handful of them. Number 1 is work to better understand the nuanced perceptions of open space by both nearby residents and the wider public. So you need to, in that context, you're asking yourself questions like, what do people value in the landscape? What looks dangerous to them or undesirable in what you're doing or thinking of doing? And then when we've been talking to land managers about these strategies, this one has emerged as something where people have reflected back to us repeatedly that they see this as a logical first step to all the other steps. And so they're on board with this idea that all of them want to work to better understand the nuances of these perceptions. So we've started to sort of sequence some of these considerations in our work as well. And you can see this one is logically very much a precursor to considering things like perceptions and conformity. Another one I want to just bring attention to quickly is under co-management. One thing I've learned while doing this project is that Native communities across the the US, but also the upper Midwest, are increasingly participating in regional stewardship, working with government agencies, working with county and municipal governments on restoration. It's interesting because they're following a lot of the same protocols for conducting stewardship for a certain kind of biodiversity. But at the same time, their interest is also in making sure that landscape reflects spiritual values, it suits subsistence purposes, and other kinds of cultural meanings. So they're coming at it from a different set of motivations, and yet they're very motivated by that. And it leads them to choose to have management schemes that really do address the concerns that are faced by threatened ecosystems and ecosystems threatened by climate. So it's a very interesting way to think about getting a lot more people helping you on the landscape with your work. And then finally, conformity. I wanted to call this one out here, that to work with rather than against the human preference for conformity. I think land managers we're finding have the hardest time when they first see this one getting their head around it and thinking, what does that mean? But it's really as simple as, there's even been research that shows if you can get like 4 to 5 homeowners in a row to replace turf grass with native plantings, that you start to change the conception of what the social norm is. And if you look at the work of some social psychologists like Doug Mackenzie Moore, he really points out that's the key to making social change, is getting people to think that the social norm has changed. We used to all, if some of us that were really green were bringing our bags to the grocery stores a decade ago, people were giving us dirty looks, including the bagger. And now everybody does it. And you get the dirty looks if you don't. And it's the same thing with what you plant in your yard. So now the question is, we wanted to ask the group how they define a healthy prairie ecosystem.
This is a trick question.
So yeah, if someone wants to open up their mic and share, feel free. Love to hear your voices as well.
I know this one usually brings me a lot of silence when I've asked it. Because I think, and I'll go ahead and inject this before people say anything, I think our first impulse, and I'm guilty, is to, well, we'll know it if we see it. And if you're a land manager, or if you're someone who does a great deal of natural resource management, you trust your gut to know when a system seems healthy or not. And you might be able to enumerate a few character traits, but to come up with, as Mario said, some sort of systematic approach, that can be difficult. But we were just curious what people's thoughts were.
So Karen Peterson, her response in the chat is diverse and resilient to stressors.
Okay.
And then Ted Hafner says it depends on the goals.
And that's an interesting point, actually, both of those. I will be talking a little bit about diversity and how that relates to those stressors and the resiliency. As far as relating to the goals, that's true, and also it can or it could not be related to the goals. So there can be measures of healthy that also reside outside of what our goals are. And we can definitely move towards a goal with full awareness that we're also not necessarily optimizing health. So we want to make sure that, yeah, we think about that. But it is true that the goals are going to be very foundational. Any other thoughts? I'm wondering, after we purposely left off with Mario discussing the social considerations, because we were wondering how much people think of a healthy prairie being intertwined with humans. Like the existence of humans in a prairie as part of their indicators of health.
Well, but we might want to just let folks ponder that and move to the next section. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, that's a really important point that I just made there, because it can be tempting for a lot of people to think that if we just leave things alone, that it will return to some sort of natural health. But the state of prairies, particularly in the north, or the American Midwest and the U.S. Great Plains, have for thousands of years been intertwined with human management and intervention. So those two systems really do, I mean, it is a linked system. Ecosystems depend on us, in particular prairies. So I'm going to refer you back to this adaptation process, this framework, and I will talk a little bit about how this is used. So when it comes to, this is also not just used in the framework with the U.S. Forest Service, but a lot of agencies that do adaptation planning. And the adaptation options that can be chosen range themselves. And so you have to understand that as you're moving to the future, you are selecting a course of action that runs along this continuum between resisting, or you're managing to persist, you know, to keep that system persisting as it is in the face of climate change, to becoming a bit more resilient, and then all the way on the far right to actually embracing and managing for the full change, the full transition that could fundamentally change that system as climate change progresses. But now let's talk about some of the features of a healthy prairie. So as one of the people typed in there, diverse and resilient to stressors, you know, it is true that when you look at the character traits of a good, healthy prairie, they're extremely naturally resilient to a lot of climate shifts, to a lot of the wet and dry cycles we've talked about, to the heat, to the cold. It is one of the most naturally resilient ecosystems that there is. However, a healthy prairie, at the very minimum, has to have a certain level of biodiversity. And I think sometimes we just manage to increase it without really knowing what that ultimate goal is. What's the prime? Some studies have shown that you need between 150 to 300 species of plants in order to fully cover the range of biodiversity that you're looking for. And that means both I'm jumping down the structural as well as the genetic biodiversity, because it is with that range that you are more resilient to the different disturbances that would come in. In addition, I already mentioned the insects and other arthropod populations. There's less known about those populations than almost any, and this is not just for prairie studies. And just to give you an example, the insect population can consume just as much biomass as a full herd of bison. So it has a substantial and an incredible impact on the structure and function of a prairie. And those insect interactions are going to be very vulnerable to temperature changes. In addition, we as humans need to continue to respect the fact that you can't just continue to disturb a particular prairie in the same exact way, because what you will do is you will not vary the diversity in a structural sense. You need to vary up the type of disturbances that you have in order to maintain a wide range of habitats, of cool microhabitats, of connectedness that's needed in order to enable some of the migration that's likely to take place as climate change progresses. Another feature that's very unique to grasslands and prairies is that they have a mix of cool and warm season grass species. And what everybody on here probably knows is that your cool season are most active, and that's both the shoot and the root systems during the spring and fall when you have cooler temperatures. And then the warm season grasses are productive during the heat of summer. So that what you have is a very productive growing season all throughout the entire season. So given these features, we have already come up with some preliminary adaptation strategies overall that could apply to nearly all of them, which piggyback what I was talking about, increasing that plant and insect biodiversity, improving the landscape connectivity, increasing prescribed burns. I know I'm advocating for a particular disturbance, but we in most cases haven't been burning enough. And that goes along with invasive species and woody plant encroachment. And strengthening the regional networks. There have been a large number of really good conservation groups and networks and nonprofits. And we find that those networks are going to be crucial moving forward. The rate that climate change is impacting these systems means that coordination in those conservation goals is going to be really important for having the most impact. And so the resource, the printed resource, will help step you through that framework I talked about by giving you menus of options and guiding some of the ways that they interact. For example, I have one here about increasing biodiversity by using prescribed burns. And then with the rest of this, and I'll go ahead and show you a zoom in. We can't stress enough in this resource that you have to have very good, solid conservation goals. And so there will be some a space given to helping people, to guide people who haven't really zeroed in on those goals. And this is just an example of that. In addition, once you have the goals, there will be some subsets, ways to pick exactly what type of climate stressor would most impact that specific goal. In this case, we're looking at extreme heat. If you're trying to use more prescribed burns in an area to improve the disturbance and increase biodiversity, extreme heat for this particular habitat could be something that really hurts it by, as the evaluation says, interfering with timing, causing more intense fires than you need, causing conditions where soil moisture isn't appropriate, etc. In this particular case, now the resource would guide you then to a menu of possible adaptation strategies that range. In this particular case, you might select modifying the fire regime. And that would mean, things like burning smaller patches, shifting the timing. There's a range of ways that you can modify it. And there'll be more guidance, and this is where networks are really helpful in helping people get more information. And then finally, finishing out that cycle by monitoring. It's not enough to make a change in practice. You have to go back to what that original goal was and know if you're meeting it with these changes in practice. In this particular case, that would be conducting some sort of plant or insect survey, and they don't have to be that detailed. But there is, again, help with the networks in how to get you connected with people to get those surveys done. Now you've come full circle and you can identify whether or not this practice has really gotten you where you need to be. And so now I'm going to let Mario talk about the framework for social considerations.
Yeah, so you're a land manager. You reached a point where you've settled on some management strategies for climate change by using the kind of resources that we're working towards here. But then the question is, how do you think about, or how do you move forward with the social components of that you need to? So we'll take this example of changing the burn cycle or burn frequency, and you ask yourself, what is the public's perception of these changes going to be? And I should step back a second and say, the basic approach I'm thinking about right now in terms of creating a resource is some sort of a set of nested questions where you'll ask yourself questions that lead to other questions, and you'll be generating your specific social strategies as you go along. So in this case, you're asking yourself, what are their perceptions going to be? Are they going to think of that fire is only getting more dangerous as the climate gets hotter, and they're scared of seeing more burning going on earlier in the season? Will they appreciate that the burns are happening earlier while it's still moister and cooler? And will they see the adaptation that you're trying to undertake? Will there be a perception that starting to burn earlier will also lead to more burning later as well? And again, you have to ask yourself, are there other perceptions of your change in management regime that are going to be important. And then you can ask, how will the public actually respond to these changes? Because, you know, they can be fine with it. They can sit around and stew about it. And, you know, and maybe they stew about it for a while, but it jumps up and bites you in a strange way, you know, later in something like a political election. And so the question becomes, at some point, are they going to go to their aldermen, to their councilmen? Are they going to talk to you and your staff? Do you have the kind of relationship with other landowners, with residents, with political figures, community leaders, such that they're comfortable coming to you with concerns, and you have that open door? Are they going to organize their neighbors to take some sort of action that they perceive? And again, you have to ask yourself, and what else might I want to anticipate? So again, you circle to this question of what response or change do you want to see from the public? And I divide those into two categories. You know, are you looking to get support for something, or are you trying to get participation in something? Are you trying to get both? And of course, it could be, if you guys have thoughts on other kinds of responses that you think are categorically different, please, you know, please share those. I'm happy to try to work them into this. And then you have to ask yourself, now, what sort of specifically do you want? In the case of burning, I'm assuming that support is the more important of these two things, that you're not looking to have lots of the public come out and burn Prairie with you, but you want there to be a political support for it so we don't end up with another bird moratorium in Cook County again at some point. And again, you have to ask yourself some questions that will lead you to then deciding which of the 7 strategies that we laid out before are most appropriate in your situation. So do you want, you know, people to value living next to a biodiverse preserve, to know and appreciate fire safety? You want them to speak up at public meetings for fire management. You want the alderperson to be making your case for you rather than being in a reactive position where somebody else has gone and talked to that person first. And you want to ask yourself, if you want to make these changes, how much are you talking about different audiences? Are you talking about nearby neighbors? Are you talking about a wider regional audience? Are you talking about business interests? Are you talking about politicians? So all of that will help you choose a strategy. From what we just discussed about burning, you can see that last one, right, is that you want to cultivate relationships with political leaders, and grassroots leaders then is going to rank really high for you if you're addressing this concern. But another thing to think about when you look at this list is, it occurs to me that something like community science, we originally, as I was introducing this idea, said, well, you're probably looking mostly at wanting to get support and not participation. But if you consider something like community science, getting more kids, getting more families, more people into the preserve and having them understand the ecology, is that also a way to work from participation, to work from action to support? So looking at the social considerations should help you even to answer those questions. The questions lead you to the considerations, but the considerations can also inform backwards onto what you've been thinking about. And so then ultimately, once you've chosen some of those strategies, you ask, is there an order in which to pursue them? Who do I need to recruit as a collaborator? What kind of seasonal or episodic help do we need? What other resources and funding will be needed? And where can I get help with getting started? And that's where I think this idea of building stronger regional networks of land managers is key, and having those networks plug in even to some of the other sorts of networks in the region that have social science or public engagement or environmental education expertise, say like the CW education group, would be an important consideration. So now the big question is, you've heard from us a little bit about the ecological management, resource under development, and the social science approach. Do people have suggestions? Do people have ideas or additions?
And we, to be clear, we have another quick example we can run through if that's something people would like to see first.
What do you think is missing here?
And again, the chat is open for you to type or unmute and speak up and share what thoughts you've got.
So I expected, I see a chat here about the conflict between increasing burning and negative impacts on pollinators. And this is where we go back to the here, I'm actually going to go to my slide. Yes. So I have this other example, but where I would say that first one, the defining the conservation goal is really important. But more to that point is the larger suggestion of coordinating these conservation goals across a larger region. But I would also add to that, so you're going to have conflicts. There's going to be some tough choices here when it comes to, are you manage, an invasive species is a rabbit hole I didn't introduce here, because we can easily talk about ways to manage in order to reduce invasive species and the suite of harms that could do to biodiversity, or the ways that can work against us, or feel that it sucks up a lot of our time and we never get to a larger conservation goal. So we're going to have a coordinated effort. We're going to have some very well-defined goals to reach. And I would say this is an excellent place to talk about where we have to fill in some gaps. There's clearly some information when you are managing, especially for pollinators. There's a great deal of information about what we do and don't know about behavior of a lot of those. Now, I can extend that to birds or a lot of other wildlife that you might have in an ecosystem. And any time, and I've heard this time and again from not just researchers, but natural resource managers, that whenever you manage for one species, you are almost always heading down the wrong direction, because you're ignoring the holistic interactions that occur in an ecosystem. Now, I'm just relating that. I think that is an excellent place for this network of land managers to get together, natural resource managers, and the broader networks for community engagement and for education to get involved and find out what the pros and cons of these different conservation goals are, and whether managing for one species is really where we want to go. This is a conversation that's nothing new, not just to prairies, but nothing new to conservation in general. So it's not exactly a settled argument, but I would say we do need to settle on what we're doing, because the rate of climate change means we don't have the luxury of time. So, and I think there's some more questions here, unless I'm missing. Oh, okay. So really quickly, I'll run through this final because I think it's really important. This final example that I have has to do with water. I tried to go a different direction, but I have another reason I did this. So let's say you have something where you're trying to maintain a riparian prairie. You're trying to reduce the amount of erosion because you're in a floodplain. So the assessment of climate stressors would be flooding, which is definitely on our minds this year. You evaluate that not only does that cause some soil erosion, but some slope instability. And given the projections for flooding, it could be really big. And here is where I want people to start thinking outside the box, which is one of the strategies that we identify would be upstream design or upstream changes, so that we're not reacting so much to floods, but that we're actually taking a more holistic and a long-term and region-wide approach to lessening those impacts. And then obviously monitoring would be assessing slope stability and soil loss, for example. So, looking more closely at each of those, obviously you would step through, keep in mind, this is not a resource that is a checklist of this is what you should do. It is a resource helping you to think about how to think through that process and include climate change stressors in your process. And so in this case, the assess would lead you to choosing flooding as one of the stressors and that evaluation, and then identifying just one example, you know, looking at managing upstream, how that stream is being allowed to flood so heavily in your area. And so this is one area I would like to hand over and have Mario talk just a bit about that.
Yeah, I want to go super quick here and just say that the main point I wanted to make in this one is that this whole idea of something that has to change upstream for what's happening downstream, so that you're in less of a position to convince people to accept things that they might think of as a loss, because then they're going to have some sort of gain. You have to convince people upstream in some sense that they need to be altruistic enough to make changes to prevent problems downstream. But ultimately, some of that strategy will be helping them to understand the stake they have at the regional level with those downstream people, with asking for the same kind of reciprocity at a later date, and the need to work at the regional scale and do things like recruit the local planning agencies to be your advocate, and for them to be working for regional solutions at the political and the local level.
So one of our last questions before we wrap it up here would be any lingering questions, particularly about those social considerations. And I'll go ahead and throw it up here. Whoops, I had meant to put another question on here and I think I missed it. Darn. I would return you to the original of what can this resource do to help you meet your management goals. And I am trying to read one of these, sorry. You want to read that one?
Oh, here, how can we leverage how can we leverage social conformity to increase inclusivity, which leads to, oh my God, can I read this? Which leads to personal commitment, sort of the only you can prevent forest fires mode. It's interesting. Some of the things they've done in this social psychology is talking about a visible and durable commitment. So when you put a sign up that tells everybody to stop idling your car in front of school, everybody sits under the sign that says don't idle your car. But since everybody's doing it, they all keep idling. But what they've discovered is if you get the person to sign a commitment saying, I'm not going to idle in front of school, then to put the sticker in their window that says, I don't idle in front of the school, then they feel like a hypocrite if they're doing it. They turn off the motor, and other people then follow suit because they see that norm is changing. And gee, we all do shut our engines off while we're waiting for our kids. There's been an effort to do some of the same with recycling, with labels and things on recycling bins, where you're really showing pride in what you're doing by putting your recycling out. And so I would say that's the kind of thing. I'm not quite sure where you're going with inclusivity here.
I think more it's about the personal commitment piece.
Yeah. But that sort of thing, they realized they had to stop publishing the letters. At Petrified Forest National Monument, they stopped publishing the apologetic letters from the people who were returning the petrified stones, and they stopped having the big display case of all the stone that had been returned, because that was making it normative to take stone and mail it back and get attention for it. So you want to think about you don't want to draw attention to the negative behavior, even as you are encouraging the positive one.
Right. Well, that's an excellent point. It's tricky. All these things are tricky. So do we have anything else? Okay.
Did you want to type into the chat though,
No, he already did.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and wrap it up by just showing this slide again. I won't go through every single thing, but obviously I do want to say that one of the most important things about adapting to climate change in prairies, whether you're in this region or not, but I'd say even more so because of that gradient to urban systems, is doing what you can to increase plant and insect biodiversity, because it is exact, and to think of it that structural and genetic, to think of it in many different ways, because it is that particular feature alone that makes prairies and grasslands and their urban counterparts so resilient. And in order to leverage that resilience, you really have to make a focus on that. So I would say the landscape connectivity and some of these other things really just sort of go to help support the biodiversity push. And as a reminder, we're going to have some draft. We still have an advisory group that we're showing this to. Some of you on the call, I think, are on that, and you'll have the chance to help participate and shape some of the ways that this is being drafted and how it's being presented. And there is actually going to be an online tool that will go along with this as well. Hopefully all that first phased out in June. I don't want to forget to mention that we're already working with this project at strengthening the networks. One of the ways is by working with some of the researchers in the region. Dr. Becky Barak has, through our network, through this group and through her own research, is doing, for example, a seed sourcing survey. And her research at the Morton Arboretum, for which this picture is at looking at different plant compositions in prairies and some of the different diversity or growth patterns that those assemblages have. It is exactly this type of research and entomology and some other research that we need to help fill in some of these gaps, or at least outline in this particular resource is still a gap, is still an unknown, and that we can get that message then back to the research community and get some action on that. And so it is with that I direct you to our website, the cwprairies.org. I was about to undergo some changes, and that's a place where you can add your name if you're not already participating. And I'm looking at getting out at least some sort of a update or newsletter, but it will probably be after June when we do get that first phase out. And then following this call, I believe, Todd, you'll pick up at this and let people know there will be some follow-up after this vital session as well. And I think, laughingly, but I'm going to go ahead and use it, we had talked about if people want to be guinea pigs, although I said in this case there have to be prairie dogs, and help pilot some of this. And we already have one prairie that we're using to help pilot some of this framework. But if anybody else is interested in being a prairie dog, we're more than happy to have you. And with that, I will pass it back to Todd.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, I put a link in the chat that is to a quick survey that you'll be able to give us feedback, as well as to how you'd like to stay involved or suggest topics for further exploration. So please, please, please take time to do that. I'm also going to email it to you immediately after, so you'll have that afterwards. Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just gonna say that we're gonna give people the opportunity with a survey that we'll be emailing out and that you've put right there. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll also be asking you what other topics you'd be interested in hearing more about. So please let us know. And thank you to our guests, Katherine and Mario. So it's fantastic. Really
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks to everyone who chose to participate today. This has been really valuable, and we look forward to hearing more from you.